So Swift is a great language, but one of the things that can take a little time to get your head around is decoding JSON strings when they have dates in them. And there's a couple of different options here. You might have a Unix epoch, which is seconds or minutes since 1970. And we can decode it into our user struct, which is represented here, by using JSONDecoder. And here we have a key decoding strategy, which is convert from snake case, because our backend potentially would have timestamp written that way, and we want to have it in the nice Swifty way. So we convert from snake case, and we can have a date decoding strategy, and this one is seconds since 1970. Let's see if this prints out our result. We'll let that return optional, since we're in an if let, that should work fine. And it prints no with a timestamp. And of course, this isn't how you'd usually print out the timestamp to a user, but for a console log, that's fine. So we're talking about ISO 8601. Our key decoding strategy doesn't change. But our date decoding strategy is going to be ISO 8601. Let's see if this prints out. So it prints out both results. That's looking pretty good, but there's an issue. And the issue is if you use milliseconds. So instead of using this JSON string, we can just copy and paste this, we're expecting this data to fail where we use the milliseconds. We can use the same decoder, so that's our data, but we're using the same decoder. What we're expecting to happen here is it to fail when milliseconds are used in the timestamp. So print is never going to be called. So we can actually try to see this by, instead of using our if let pattern, we try to decode, but use a force unwrap. And that force unwrap should fail. Okay, of course, we need to unwrap that data. Unexpectedly raised an error. Date string isn't properly formatted. So what's happening here is Swift doesn't support milliseconds, which is obviously quite upsetting. So there's no surprise here. We have an extension. And what that extension does is it makes our ISO 8601 decoder compatible with milliseconds. And it's very likely that a backend would have milliseconds. So our string with milliseconds, so let's try and remember that, needs to be decoded into our user struct. Decoder ISO milliseconds still has a JSON decoder. Decoder ISO milliseconds key decoding strategy is still from Snakecase. So our date decoding strategy is going to be ISO 8601 with seconds. And as before, equals, this is our JSON string milliseconds dot data using UTF-8. Decoder ISO milliseconds from our data. If we print that result, and a third is now printed. So this work has to go into making our decoder compatible to be able to use ISO 601 with seconds. It's very annoying, but it's one of the things that has to work. So it's actually fractional seconds, not seconds, so it's milliseconds. But if your backend is producing milliseconds, then you have to be able to deal with that. And it's one of the things that can be really annoying while using Swift. This particular version needs to have, I think it's iOS 11. And within the notes of the YouTube video, there's a way of making this work with iOS 9 and later, which pretty much is going to cover most of your users if you're using this in a production app.